Okay, can you guys hear me? You people, I should say. Okay, good. Is everyone doing all right? Hope you enjoyed the week off. No meetings. Made us get a little behind, but that always seems to happen. You're stuck on the week 6 stuff. Yeah, I mean, I am too, for everybody. I'm not going to rush ahead because we missed a few meetings, and so I want to just kind of recap that. Okay. So we're basically just going to go over the exercises that I had you do as an assignment, just to remind you. And just doing that will remind you of some of the basic things that we went over. Yeah, and then I will present the next step. So I'm not going to not present anything because we missed meetings. I'm going to do everything I was going to do. It just means we're going a little bit slower right now. We'll catch up later. I've never had a semester where something like that didn't happen. So we should be all right. Okay. Are there any other questions? See, there's only 3 of you, so some people may have gotten confused because of last week and are just wondering if we're not having meetings. Not sure. But regardless, you're here, and we'll make another video for those people. And so unless you have questions, if you have specific questions about week 6, or if you want to just see if we address it, we can do it that way as well. So let's see. I try to upload it here on the... Okay, that won't work because then I can't record it. Can you read that? Can you read what I have up? Or is it too small? Kinda, yeah. Let me do it a different way. No, slightly better. So, we'll just go through them. Yeah, a little small. I think this works well enough. So the first one that I had you do was just, of course Sandra is smart. How could she not be, since she's a doctor? Right? So if we're reviewing, I would ask you, is there an argument there? Right? And the answer is yes, there's an argument. Why is there an argument? Well, because someone's making a claim and supporting it with other claims, right? There's a conclusion supported by one or more premises, so it's an argument. And so the exercise for you was to put that into argument, into a premise conclusion format, so it's really easy to scan everything. I'm not sure why premise 2... Oh yeah, that's the missing premise, exactly. So you didn't have to put in premise 2. It's just if you're thorough, you would. But basically all it's saying is, well, Sandra is a doctor, so therefore Sandra is super smart. Right? Just a tiny, quick little argument. But to lay out its structure, it's helpful to put it into this premise conclusion format. Yeah. So most people got that pretty straightforwardly because we went over it in class and then the assignment was up. Some people didn't realize what I was asking for and did something totally different. The next one, right? It's another argument. You should either love America or leave it. Since you don't love America, you should leave it. Right? What's the takeaway message? What is this person trying to say? Right? The conclusion here is an implied conclusion of you should leave America, right? And the reasons for that being, well, you've only got 2 choices. You must love it or leave it. Since you don't love it, you got to leave it, right? It's a valid argument form. Of course, premise number 1 is very questionable, right? It's something you might call a false dichotomy. There might be all sorts of other options, right? Those don't seem to be the only options available. So if I was going to evaluate the argument, I would say it's a valid argument. The conclusion follows from the premises, but premise 1 is unlikely to be correct. But that's not what I was asking you to do. I was just asking you to put it into this format, right? So we have just a premise, conclusion. Okay, and that way it makes it easier for you to think about the argument structure, and you can more easily evaluate the premises that the argument is built on just by laying them out like that. Okay, I got to quickly go over to that page. The next one was I don't think it's going to rain tomorrow. The weather forecast says it'll be sunny all day. Right? So you'd have something like this. It's pretty obvious, right? Someone's making a claim about whether or not it's going to rain tomorrow, and then they provide their reasons. Well, they got their reason. They got their information from a weather forecast. Kind of makes sense, right? So you would just lay it out like that. The weather forecast says it'll be sunny all day tomorrow, so probably it's not going to rain tomorrow. Also notice I do want you to follow the format. That was one thing as well, as people kind of get what I'm asking for. We're able to lay out the premises to some extent and the conclusion, but they should be clearly labeled, right? It should say premise 1 or P1, and it should say conclusion or C at the bottom, right? The whole structure that I have here with the little line in between, just to keep it on this, so we're all using the same format. Took out the word super. Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's sort of one of those words that didn't need to be in there, right? Didn't I leave it out as well? I think I did. Yeah, that's good, right? That's what I call trimming the fats. You sort of get rid of the stuff that's not really doing any extra work. The main point is that she's smart because she's the doctor. So Maggie, I think that's right. So you couldn't have an implied premise for 3 if it doesn't usually rain when it's sunny. Yeah, that's a good question. I suppose if it says that it's sunny all day, that automatically would mean no rain, right? If we were to take it literally, so it just depend on how literal you take that statement. If you really think if you define it to a certain area at a certain time or a certain time range, and the claim is it will only be sunny the whole time, then that will automatically mean that there's no rain, right? Of course, often people don't talk that literally, but also the conclusion, it's not going to rain tomorrow. People don't necessarily always take everything very, very literally. Right? For example, if you're just wondering if you can go have a picnic at the park, you're not worried if there's one part of the city or something where there's a little rainfall for 1 minute, right? For all intents and purposes, it was sunny all day. There wasn't any rain when you had your picnic. Yeah. So I hope that answers it. Yeah. But there's no harm in always making something explicit. Whenever there's sort of a gap, and you think you can identify the statement that would bridge that gap better. For example, if it's sunny all day tomorrow, then it's not going to rain tomorrow, right? That's the implied premise, and there's no harm with putting that in there, just so you can evaluate it. No, I wouldn't have marked that wrong. No. And I'm giving a lot of. I haven't graded it yet, but I'll give a lot of leeway. It's mostly, were you able to basically get the premises and the conclusion identified correctly, and were you able to lay it out the way I asked? Premise 1, da-da-da-da-da. Premise 2, da-da-da-da-da. Line, conclusion, da-da-da-da-da. Right, that's the main thing here. There'll be some wiggle room for, for things like that. Socrates must be mortal since he's human. After all, humans are mortal. So the since tells us that there's a premise, right? It's a premise indicator. So Socrates is human, you'd put in there. And remember, don't say he's human, right? Some people forgot about leaving out pronouns when possible, whenever you can say the specific thing or the specific name. So people did make that mistake, and that will cost a little bit. I don't think I'll mark the whole thing wrong, but if you forgot to say Socrates is human and you just said he is human, that would not be right. You need to always make sure you're saying specifically who it is that you're talking about. Yes, yeah, the order does not matter. Yeah. The order is fine. It won't change the reasoning, right? It just doesn't change the reasoning whether you put it first or second. It's a little bit like in math, right? It doesn't matter if you say 2 plus 3 or 3 plus 2, you're going to get the same results, right? It's the same sort of thing. It doesn't work for subtraction, of course, right? But here the analogy is just to addition. It's the same sort of thing. It does not really matter which order of the premises you use, right? All you know is, well, when you put them together, you know you get the conclusion, right? Yeah, that's fine. Okay. And was that the last one? Okay, then finally, every crow I've ever seen has been black. I bet the next crow will be black as well. Yeah. So the main claim being made here is some sort of prediction, right, about, well, when I next see a crow, I think it's going to be black. And what are you basing that on? Well, your past experience. Right, so this is what you'd call an inductive argument. And today I'll explain the difference between inductive and deductive, okay? So this would be an inductive argument because the premise makes the conclusion very likely. Of course, it's possible that even if I've only seen black crows, it's logically possible that suddenly I see a gray crow or even a pink crow, right? Even though that's very unlikely given what we know about the natural world, it's a logical possibility, right? So that's what makes this an inductive argument. It's a good argument because it's strong evidence that I'm always going to be seeing black crows, but you can't logically rule out the possibility that there's a non-black crow, right? So that's what makes this an inductive argument rather than a deductive argument. The Socrates argument was deductive, right? Because if those premises are true, the conclusion logically has to be true. Whereas here, it makes the conclusion very likely to be true, but there's a small logical possibility that it's not, even if the premises are true. Okay, so now in terms of, I tried to review most of the stuff that we went over just in going over these 5 exercises, right? You've got your main idea, which is that we're evaluating arguments, and arguments are just statements that support another statement. And that makes sense because we argue about things, and that's how we do it. We discuss things, and people think one thing is true, somebody else thinks something else is true. Well, how do you figure out who's got the good argument? You have to be a good critical thinker. You have to know how to evaluate arguments, right? And that's what you're learning to do here. And part of that process is learning how to put it into this format, at least while you're taking this class, so you sort of get in your head, the ability to extract from a bunch of information just the relevant factors for evaluating the arguments. The first one, sure, yes, yeah, I'll go back up. Yeah, no problem. There you go. Still recording, yep, good. So that's the basics, right? Just doing some review, not reviewing any of the psychology stuff we did at the beginning, but just what we started doing, argument evaluation, right? We started looking at argument structure and premise conclusion format. So that's all I'm reviewing right now. Reminding you that the idea of an argument is central to the class, and an argument is just some sort of statement that someone's making, and then they're supporting it with other statements. You're telling people why your conclusion is correct, right? So we call an argument a conclusion that's supported by one or more premises. And then we can really show what an argument looks like abstractly by doing it in this format. So you're just laying out the premises, taking out everything you don't need, making everything crystal clear. So you're not saying he or it or she or they when you don't have to. When you know who it is, you put in who it is, right? And you label all the premises and the conclusion clearly. And yeah, look for missing premises, right? Sometimes it's going to be very obvious that there's a premise missing to help you understand what the argument structure really is. Makes more sense in class. That's often how it is. It's often how it is. I've had the same experience, for sure. Yeah. So I think that was really it. I tried to go through how to put an argument into this premise conclusion format, right? And we went over premise indicators and conclusion indicators that'll also help you. So again, you're we're imagining that you're finding an argument in the wild that someone has either spoken or written down. Um, People write, and when people write and speak, they say a lot more than they strictly need to present an argument. So to evaluate the argument that's been provided, it's your job to sort of get rid of all the extraneous stuff and zero in on just the main claim that's being made and then the premises that support it. One other thing we got into is that, well, sometimes when you provide an argument and you've provided your premises, sometimes you have to back up those premises themselves, right? Because it's very easy to create an argument for some conclusion where you're using premises that people might not agree with at all, right? So sometimes your basic premises need some backup as well. So then you get into sub-arguments, and that can get a little complicated. I don't think I'm going to do much with it. I just want that to be something in your mind, that you understand that sometimes what people present is something quite complex, where they are providing support for the premises, and then those premises provide support for the main conclusion. And sometimes this can get nested, where you have a very, very complex argument. So we looked at that Big Bang argument for the existence of God, the Kalam cosmological argument, where we have premises being backed up by further premises. So we have these little sub-arguments within the large argument. Okay, I don't think I'm leaving anything else out. Was there anything just that you wanted more reminder about, or sort of review more before I move on? While I'm switching this, you think about it for a minute, because I'm happy to go back and clarify things wherever needed. Okay, share my screen. Okay. Oh, I forgot to set up my phone to be linked with it. Here, why don't you take a couple-minute break? I'm going to pause this for a second. It's going to be a lot easier if I can switch the Prezi with my phone and I have to keep going back and forth. So why don't you just review in your head what we've gone over and maybe think about something that I need to address. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video for a second for other people. Okay, this might take... Let's see. Does it work? Yes. Perfect. Okay. Hope you're back. That didn't take that long. So we're going to just move ahead. I'm skipping a whole presentation on argument structure. That's one of the ways that we'll get back on track. And I've realized that it's kind of time consuming for something that we're not going to use a whole lot. So I'm deciding to skip right ahead to deductive reasoning. Okay. So if you look on your syllabus, the official description of this course, two of the very important parts of it are that you understand how deductive reasoning works and how inductive reasoning works. Deductive reasoning, I'll explain what it is, but I'm just telling you, I'm just setting it up, right? Those are your two main kinds of reasoning that we're going to look at, deductive and inductive, and we're going to see what the difference is between them, okay? And deductive reasoning will then segue into logic. Okay, for some people that's a bad word, if you're aware of what logic is, or for some people it's intimidating because it looks a little bit like algebra or something like that. I'm trying to figure out the best way to teach logic. I think I've said this before, I feel like if you know how to learn a simple game like chess or even checkers or something like that, you've got the mental capacity to do it, right? It's just some simple rules that you follow. And then if I just state what the objective is, think of it as how to win the game, that's all it really is. So I'm trying to do this in different ways, but I've taught my 7-year-old how to do some of this stuff. Now, of course, he gets an in-home tutor, but still, people get so intimidated by logic because of the way it looks. But if you just think of it as some sort of new game, um, then it would work. I was not giving strategy game talent. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it is still going to be harder for some people than for others, and that's okay. I do think it's within everyone's reach. If you're with me from the beginning and you learn just a couple of the basic rules, and then I explain to you how to do it. Cards Against Humanity is a fun game. Yeah. Okay. Well, enough preamble. Let's actually just get into it. Okay. So I'll explain to you what the difference between inductive and deductive is. Arguments. We've gotten into this a little bit already. I've been teasing this from the beginning, I think. And then we'll look at the concepts of soundness and validity. Okay, it's very important. Those concepts are very important in evaluating an argument. If you remember, there are two components to evaluating an argument, right? There's the question, are those premises actually true, right? You need your argument to be based on true information, correct information, right? So you need to evaluate the premises somehow. That's its own difficult job. Logic won't necessarily help you with that. You just have to know what the world is like, right? You have to understand what science is like, perhaps. That's going to be its own sort of challenge. So that's one component of evaluating an argument. Are the premises true? The other one is, do the premises actually support the conclusion? Such that if they were true, would the conclusion necessarily have to be true as well, right? There are two components to evaluating an argument. So soundness and validity address that, right? That helps us think about how to evaluate arguments in that way. And then that will segue into, like I said, propositional logic. We'll sort of make the switch. Hopefully it'll be painless as we move from English words into symbols. So deductive versus inductive. Well, in a good inductive argument, if you have true premises, if your premises really are true, then the conclusion is really likely to be true. For example, the crow example that I just gave earlier, right? Makes a whole lot of sense that if you never see a non-black crow, you kind of make a prediction and say, well, I think all crows are always black, as far as I know, as far as we've ever observed in the entire world over time. And yet, even though you've had those experiences, it's logically possible. Right? It's compatible with your present experience that in the future there might be a pink crow. Right? It's not logically incompatible. It doesn't make it's not nonsense to imagine something like that. It's just weird, right? So, I'll give you another example. I've given this example before. I've enjoyed almost every slice of pizza I've ever eaten. I will enjoy the next slice of pizza I eat. Now, you kind of, by looking at it, you almost have to sort of imagine that the conclusion that I'm offering is a tentative one. It's a probable one, something that I think is likely, right? So you could even insert in your head, well, probably I will enjoy the next slice of pizza I eat, right? Even though maybe I've never had a bad slice of pizza, and so I just think, well, if the pizza is from just a regular pizza place, in all likelihood, it's going to be a good pizza. Right? This is good reasoning. We rely on inductive reasoning all the time. You rely on your past experience to guide you towards the future all the time. Right? That's what most inductive reasoning is like. It's based on your experience, based on what we know about the world, what has happened so far. What can we say is likely to be the case? But we have to say what's likely to be the case, right? Because there's a very small chance that I will get a bad slice of pizza. Let's see, another example. We use polling a lot for inductive reasoning, right? Polls are never perfect. They're never a perfect guide to the future. but sometimes they give us a strong clue as to what's going to happen, right? But of course, as in this example right here, well, this was, yeah, it makes sense still. Yeah. The majority of Republicans polled said they'd vote for Trump in the upcoming election. Now, because of that poll, then we can conclude that in all likelihood, the majority of Republicans will vote for Trump in the upcoming election. But of course, it's logically possible that it won't happen, right? It's a possibility, even if it's a remote possibility. Simply because that first premise is true, it does not automatically follow that the conclusion must be true. It just shows that it's very likely to be true. Okay, let's see if I have another example. In court cases, that's usually what it is, right? So here we have one for arguing for the conclusion that Jones is the murderer, right? This is like a court case where perhaps the prosecutor is summarizing the case against Jones. You list all these different pieces of evidence. Perhaps none of these all by themselves means that Jones is the murderer, but taken all together, they provide a pretty strong case. Now, of course, then it's going to be defendant's job to say, well, even if all those premises are true, the conclusion might not be true, or they might say some of the premises are false, right? These are different ways that the defense can then evaluate this argument that's provided. Or they can show that even though premise 1, 2, and 3 are all true, perhaps there was some sort of conspiracy involved, and they can show that, or perhaps it was just coincidences, right? So there's all sorts of ways in which the defendant can argue that even if the premises are true, they might still deny the truth of the conclusion, right? They're logically compatible, right? Can everyone see that? Can you see how it's possible that perhaps Jones did have a motive, and somehow his prints were on the murder weapon, but maybe somebody else stole his gun and committed the crime with gloves on, right? And maybe Jones was near there, but for an entire different reason. So it's possible that Jones wasn't the one at all, even though there's all this evidence there. Right? And of course, the more pieces of evidence you bring to the table, the stronger your case is. So for example, if you also have, as one of the premises, Jones confessed to the murder, then it's a really strong case. Right? There's still a logical possibility, of course, that Jones is crazy and just says stuff like that, or someone is forcing him to say it on pain of death. Right? There's always some logical possibility that's compatible with the truth of the premises, but yet the conclusion is false, right? It's possible. So that's what inductive arguments are like. So it kind of sounds like a weakness, but at the same time, we are so reliant on inductive reasoning, and it guides us pretty well most of the time, right? Usually, when you have a premise that's probably going to be true, then it's probably going to come true, right? Just every now and then, it doesn't. That's the problem of inductive reasoning. There's a whole problem in philosophy called the inductive problem that has to do with this, made famous by the philosopher David Hume, who talked about this. That we sort of assume on the basis of our past experience that the future is going to be just like that. But it's an assumption to say that the future resembles the past, that the future is going to be just like the past, right? There's nothing you can really say to justify that assertion. I assume that tomorrow is still going to be very much like today in most relevant respects, right? When I walk outside, the roads won't have suddenly turned into rubber, and the houses won't suddenly look like dragons, or I expect a continuous reality, but there's actually no sort of real justification for that, at least not anything that I can point to, because I can only point to what has happened to the past. And I can't say what's going to happen with absolute certainty in the future, right? So you can see we use inductive reasoning all the time, but there are sort of philosophical problems with that, because it means we're relying on conclusions that could possibly be false, right? Hume's answer was kind of like what I just said, is as human beings, we just have no choice. We sort of do this naturally. We don't even really go through the thought process of saying the future will resemble the past. Right? Who's ever actually thought that? No, but your actions, your behavior, what you say about the world, the arguments you create, the kind of reasoning you follow, it all sort of assumes that the future will resemble the past. Here's another one that's interesting philosophically for that very reason, right? Uh, if you take an intro to philosophy class, this will be familiar to you, right? You probably think it's very, very obvious that you are where you are right now, right? Now you're not technically in a classroom. Maybe it counts as a classroom if you're being taught in a room. Yeah, I don't know. Wherever you are, look around you. You're making an assumption about where you are, right? You're in your room, I assume, or in a room. Maybe you're sitting down, right? You're looking all around you at the world, and you think you've got an accurate picture of the world. Why do you think that? Well, it's because your sensory organs are telling you that, right? Your eyes are relaying a signal to your brain about the outside world. But there is a gap between premise number one and the conclusion. Simply because your senses are telling you something does not automatically have to mean that it's true, right? So the one that we come up with, yeah, it's a perception thing, right? So we can come up with all sorts of interesting illusions, like we did when we looked at the psychology stuff, right? There's all sorts of weird stuff that happens between what's out there and what I end up perceiving in my head, right? We looked at like the color illusions, like what color is the dress, or the sound, right? What were the two words that sounded different? Some people couldn't hear them both. What was it? Thunder something, brain needle, green needle, brain something. Well, the point was, you have a different perception. You have one perception. I have one perception. The reality out there is one and the same. Yeah, so color, exactly. It's the same sort of thing, right? There's this stuff out there, and you're getting a sense perception. You could be having a sense perception that is not even caused by reality at all, right? So, for example, in philosophy, the example that we bring up is dreaming, right? In a dream state, you might get all sorts of sensory information about being somewhere, and you might think, I'm really here, but you're not, right? You're having a dream. So you see the same sort of problem come up here, right? In everyday experience, we're constantly using this sort of inductive method, or inductive assumptions anyway, right? That if I'm having these experiences right now, subjectively, then the objective world probably matches what I think it is, right? And indeed, as long as you say probably, that's going to be fine, right? But you got to say probably, right? Because if it's not an inductive argument, then you'd have to provide the missing premise, right? People who like finding missing premises, you could see what that would have to be, right? It would have to be something like, if my senses are telling me that I'm in a classroom right now, then I am in a classroom right now, okay? But that premise is not obviously true. That premise itself, there are many counterexamples to it, right? So, for example, if you're dreaming, your senses might tell you that you're in a classroom, even though you're not. Right? So that missing premise, if you state it like that, that's problematic. That's why we think of this as an inductive argument. Right? So in an inductive argument, you can imagine that there's always a missing premise that you don't have to write in there. You can imagine that there's always a premise that links the premises to the conclusion by saying, well, if the premises are true, the conclusion is probably true, right? The conclusion is likely to be true. We just don't have to put that into an inductive argument every time, right? So I kind of think that on this below the surface, I think inductive arguments are disguised deductive arguments that all have this missing premise that say, if these premises are true, the conclusion is probably true. If that's too complicated, don't worry about that. Remain on the surface, right? Simply think of it in this sense, that in inductive arguments, if it's a good argument, that means true premises increase the likelihood that the conclusion is true. But there's always a logical possibility that it's not. Right? Another example. If you can take one out, what do you mean by that? That probably makes sense, but... Well, for example, like the Jones case, the murder case, right? You could take one of the premises off and you'd still have an argument remaining if it's something like that you're talking about, right? Or you can add more premises and build your case, right? Make it even stronger. But yeah, if you have one of these inductive arguments that relies on a bunch of different pieces of evidence, right? Then, if someone says, hey, but wait a minute, that premise is not true, that doesn't destroy your whole argument necessarily. You could say, okay, well, let's ignore that one. Let's see how much evidence there's still left, how much support we still have for the conclusion. So I'm not sure if that's what you meant, but yeah. Yeah, so this is part of what I was going to do in argument structure. Another way to explain it is that some arguments have linked support and other arguments have divergent support, right? So divergent support means this piece and this piece, they function separately, right? Jones was at the scene of the crime. Jones had a motive for the murder, right? These each count towards the conclusion Jones was the murderer, but they can do it separately from one another. Whereas if you have something like all humans are mortal, Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal, you can't take out any of those premises. You need both of them for the argument to work. So yes, Anna, that's right, yeah. Because it's sort of like you always have that missing premise. Oh, hey, by the way, this is the sort of argument where if the premises are true, the conclusion is more likely to be true, right? So if you take out one of the premises, you still have this kind of a structure. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, if you take one out and it simply no longer follows, right? So if you just have Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal, that does not work, right? Then there's no sort of connection between the premise and the conclusion. You need that sentence to actually spell it out. Yep, that's right. Good. Just one other example, right? I think if you were to bet, if someone were to bet you all your money, all your property, everything, against the idea that the sun will rise tomorrow. So say you just have to say the sun will rise tomorrow, and if you're right, you get $1 million. If you're wrong, everything gets taken away from you. Would you do it? By the sun rising tomorrow, I don't mean like, oh, if it's cloudy, then it doesn't count. I just mean, the world is going around the sun the whole time. That creates the appearance of the sun going around the earth, that sort of thing. Is that going to happen tomorrow? Are we still going to be circling the sun tomorrow? Yeah, exactly, right? So practically speaking, you should take that bet regardless, right? But just on its own merit, on how likely you think the sun is going to rise tomorrow, you're going to think it's very likely, probably enough to bet just about anything on, right? At the very least, make the stakes lower. I don't think you need to make the stakes lower, right? Isn't that good enough? I mean, does anyone really doubt that the sun will come up tomorrow? No, right? What are you basing it on? What are you basing that confidence on? Your past experience. This is how it's been for millennia, right? Millennia of millennia. There's no reason you think that everything's going to suddenly change. So it's so likely, right? So you might say, well, it's 99.9999999% obvious, probable that the sun will rise tomorrow, and I will bet everything I own on it that it will. Completely rational, completely reasonable. Yet at the same time, you cannot be entirely confident of that conclusion. Right? There's some remote possibility that maybe the whole Earth gets blown up tomorrow. Right? Unlikely, right? But all you need is some logical possibility that's compatible with the premise. Do you see that? So yeah, C, the conclusion there, of course that's compatible with the premise, and it seems to follow in this probabilistic inductive way. But yet at the same time, it's also logically compatible with the premise that the sun will not rise. Right? It's logically possible that even though it's always been happening, yeah, that's true. There's, you're kind of getting into Anna is getting into game theory a little bit, where you include psychology as part of how you assess a claim like that and what you should do. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's called game theory, right? Where you're sort of thinking, well, if this person's saying this, what do they know that I don't know? Things like that. Yeah. It's true. Well, take the whole bet thing out of it. Just, does anyone really doubt that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? No, I think you all assume that it will. But now maybe you think, well, it probably will, right? What probably means, like I said, out of 100, it's 99.99999. I don't even know how far that goes. But hey, is it remotely possible that even though the sun has been rising every morning for millions of years, is it even remotely possible that there's some sort of alien Death Star out there that destroys entire planets? Yeah, we know it's logically possible. We've seen it portrayed on Star Wars, right? So that's all you need, is this logical possibility that the conclusion might be false, even though the premises are true. That's what makes an inductive argument into an inductive argument. A deductive argument is different. In a deductive argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion logically has to be true. There's no way to get out of it. Yeah, it's kind of an assumption, right? So that's built into all of our inductive reasoning, this kind of assumption that the future will resemble the past. And it's a philosophical problem because we can't do without that assumption. Just try living your life without it. But at the same time, philosophers are frustrated by that because you want to be able to prove things, right? You don't want to just assume things, something like the future will resemble the past. But how can you prove it? It seems impossible. It seems like one of those things that you cannot possibly prove, but you must assume it for practical life. Yeah, I don't think you can prove it. you know. Just another example. It's good to have lots of examples so you know the variety of kinds of inductive arguments. Right, so here we have another one that's sort of like the Jones case, where we have piece of evidence after piece of evidence to support a conclusion. Right? So it's an inductive argument, right? Um, say that this is your friend and you know that their power got shut off. You figured out that that she's failing her classes, and then on top of it all, her dog died. It's a reasonable conclusion that Jennifer is not having the best day, right? That she might be experiencing some adverse psychological states like sadness and things like that, or frustration, right? It's a reasonable guess. So again, when you're dealing with other people, with people's psychological states, we're also using inductive reasoning, right? We're trying to do our best that we can based on someone's behavior to try to figure out where they're at mentally and psychologically, right? You can't sort of step right into someone's mind to see what they're figuring out, or to figure out what they're feeling. We just can't do that. We have to go through this inductive process of looking at their behavior and then thinking about what's the most likely explanation for their behavior, or what's the most likely outcome of what they're going through, what sort of life experiences they're having. And we have to look at those clues to sort of, in our minds, build up what someone is going through psychologically. This is very difficult to do, though. In some cases, it's pretty easy. Human nature can be pretty general and pretty sort of evenly spread, right? But individual people are different, and people react differently to different situations. And I think a lot of relationship problems happen this way, when people make assumptions about someone's internal states based on perhaps their behavior, or on what the other person assumes they must be going through given what they know about their life, right? We make these assumptions. Again, we can't do without that. We have to, but it's possible to create an entire narrative in your head about what someone is like and who they are like, right, and how they're likely to behave or feel. It's possible to construct these narratives that are either totally false or perhaps, not quite right, where you ask the person and they would say, no, I don't see myself that way at all. Right? Those things happen. That's because the whole process of trying to understand one another, it's an inductive process. Right? So even if all this stuff happened to Jennifer, maybe she does not care that much about the power. Right? It's possible. Some people don't care about their power getting shut off. My kids kind of they remember it from last time, and they keep wanting a power outage because it's kind of fun, right? Perhaps Jennifer, maybe she had already given up on school and she was already doing something else, and she hadn't checked on how she had been doing, and she sees that she failed her classes, but she doesn't care about that anyway. Now her dog, presumably, that might be harder, but it's also possible that it's a dog that maybe, I don't know, maybe she hasn't seen this dog in a long time, or it's possible that even though it's devastating that the dog died, maybe there's some other really good news that really balances out to some extent. Who knows, right? What I'm trying to say here is, even if all the premises are true, you don't necessarily know that the conclusion must be true. Right? There's some logical possibility that that's not the case. Maybe she did drugs all day and did not think about any of this stuff and was just high as a kite and had a great day, and then tomorrow everything will be horrible for her. Right? That's possible as well. All sorts of logical possibilities that you can come up with. Right? That's the feature of an inductive argument. You look at the argument, you say, well, it makes sense, right? It does support the conclusion, but you have to understand that there's always some logical possibility that even though the premises are true, the conclusion might be false. Right? Much less likely in the case of the sun rising, which we can know with a great degree of certainty. More difficult when it comes to other people's mental states, right? Where our inductive reasoning gets us conclusions that are less likely to be true, that have a less likelihood. They might still be, for Jennifer, that might still be, 95% of the time someone going through that will not have a good day. But there's going to be 5% that is fine. Okay, it might not be true. Okay, well, almost, but you have to talk about the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. So I'm addressing what Anna's asking. So the idea is, on both cases, let's assume that the premises are true. In an inductive argument, when you have true premises, the conclusion might not be true, even if the premises are true. That part's right, yeah. And in a deductive argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion logically just has to be true. Right? And we'll see how that works in just a minute, right? I haven't even shown you deductive yet. I'm just showing you by contrast, right? So I'm first introducing inductive. But Anna, if that's what you meant, that's correct, right? So yeah, in both cases, just sort of assume for the sake of argument, let's say the premises are true. Let's say we're not worried about that. Now, what follows? Does the conclusion necessarily follow where it has to be true if the premises are true? If that's the case, then it's deductive. If it's not the case, it's inductive, right? Like in all these examples, assume that the premises are true. It's still logically possible that the premise is not true. That the conclusion is not true, right? For any of these arguments, just simply suppose that those premises are true. In each case, you could figure out some way that even though the premises are true, the conclusion might be false. It's just unlikely. And in many cases, it's so unlikely that you don't need to worry about it, right? For example, most of the time your senses are telling you things correctly, right? Well, maybe that is an assumption. It's hard for me to say that as a philosopher. For practical purposes, let's just say that's the case. Right? You don't usually have to worry about it that much, especially with the sun rising, right? It's fine, expect it to rise, right? In other cases, you have to be a little bit more cognizant of the fact that you're using inductive reasoning. For example, when you're evaluating other people's emotional states, right? Your process is very fallible. Even though you might have all the information correct about what's happened to them objectively, you might still not exactly know what's going on inside of them subjectively. Right? There's always this sort of gap. So let's see. Oh, I'm going too fast. Okay, so that's inductive. Did I go back or forward? Okay. Yeah, I mentioned this briefly, like, right, in inductive arguments, if you have multiple premises, each of those premises will be doing its own job to support the conclusion, to make it more probable, right? So if you have the Jones case, maybe one of the premises alone just makes it 50% likely that Jones did it. Add another, now it's 60% likely, right? Add another, now it's 70% likely. In each case, you've got an inductive argument. When it's 50%, it's not a very good argument, right? 60%, that's already pretty good. That's a pretty strong case for the idea that Jones did it. That's already an argument. But you add more premises to it, more pieces of evidence, and you make it more and more likely each time, right? As long as those premises are true and they do support the conclusion in that inductive way. So that's what we mean by convergent lines of evidence pointing to something, right? Where if you took one of those lines away, all the other ones will still be pointing, right? Whereas deductive, it's different. So in a deductive argument, if it's a correct one, if it's what we're going to call logically valid, right? This is not going to be true of attempted deductive arguments, right? Someone might try a deductive argument, but it doesn't work. We'll see how that happens. But in a good one, in a good deductive argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true logically, right? On the assumption that the premises are true, the conclusion must be true in a deductive argument. So this is the classic example, right, of a deductive argument. I hope everyone can see that, right? Now, this is different from the Jennifer case, where even though she failed her classes and her dog died, it's logically possible that she's still happy, even though it seems unlikely, right? But it could happen. Here it's different. If it's really, really true that all humans are mortal, right? We're saying, just for the sake of argument, let's suppose that's true. And if it really is true that Socrates is human, well, then it has to be the case that Socrates is mortal. Because you're basically just restating the information that you already provided in the premises. You're just restating it in a different way, right? You're seeing, well, here's these two premises. If those premises are true, then logically I know this must be true as well, right? So, I mean, can you imagine any counterexample to this, like we did with Jennifer or the Jones case? You can't, right? Once you grant the truth of the premises, right, just for the sake of argument, suppose that it's true that all humans are mortals and Socrates is human. Let's say the world is like that. Can you find some sort of counter example to that, where even though that's true, Socrates is not mortal? It just does not work, right? Unless you want to get like weird with language, but that's just cheating, right? Say, oh, and the second time I say Socrates, I mean someone else or something like that. Yeah, we're not dealing with that kind of stuff, right? We're just assuming we're talking about one specific person, right? So I hope that's clear, the difference there, right? Here, if we assume the truth of the premises, that guarantees the truth of the conclusion, because it's already stated in the premises, right? The premises say that Socrates is human. What do we know about humans? They're all mortal. So of course Socrates is mortal. Right? It just follows deductively, is what that's called. It follows deductively. Another way to say it is, it's logically impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. It's just logically impossible. Now, I'll show you later on when we do propositional logic, I'll show you exactly what we mean by that, where we can look at all the logical possibilities and we'll find that there are no logical possibilities where those premises are true and the conclusion is false. It just does not work. It does not make sense. Right? So this is a good, valid argument because the truth of the conclusion is guaranteed by the truth of the premises. The conclusion must be true if the premises are true. Here's another one. Anything that degrades your moral character is bad for you. Lying degrades your moral character, so lying is bad for you. This is also a deductive argument. Now, you might disagree with either of the premises, and that's fine, because that has nothing to do with whether it's a deductive argument or not. Inductive, Maggie is asking if deductive and inductive arguments, if we use the word valid to describe them when they work. We use the word valid to describe good deductive arguments. Good inductive arguments are called strong, right? So a good inductive argument have a relative strength. Some arguments are really strong, like the argument for the sun rising. Some arguments are not quite as strong, like Jennifer's having a bad day, right? So there we use the word strength to evaluate how good an inductive argument is. For deductive arguments, we use the word valid, okay? And now I haven't even said valid or invalid yet, right? People have an idea in their head of valid, and that's a perfectly fine everyday word that people use in different ways. But in logic, it's going to mean something very specific, and you will need to stick with the definition that we have in logic of validity. Logical validity is a little bit different from what people mean when they say, oh, that's a valid point, or yeah, that's valid. It means a little bit different from that. It means something very specific that we'll actually define. Well, in fact, it means just this, right? A valid deductive argument is one in which the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. That's what all deductive arguments are trying to do. Right? So here when I say good deductive argument, I already mean a valid deductive argument. Right? So you should be able to see the same thing here as for the Socrates example. Right? Let's grant the truth of the premises just for the sake of argument. Again, you don't have to think that those premises are actually true, and so therefore you don't even have to agree with the conclusion. Saying that an argument is valid or that it's a good deductive argument does not by itself yet mean, or at least if we say that it's valid, it does not necessarily mean that we have a true conclusion, right? Because again, we have to have the two aspects of evaluating an argument, right? Does the conclusion follow, either deductively or inductively? And then are the premises actually true? But are the premises actually true? That's going to be the same kind of job, whether it's a deductive argument or an inductive argument. You just got to look at the premises and evaluate with your own mind to see if you think they're true. Right? So to test whether or not it's inductive or deductive, just don't worry about whether the premises are actually true. Don't do that part of the evaluation yet. Simply go, okay, for the sake of argument, let's suppose that these premises are true. Let's just say it really is true that anything that degrades your moral character is bad for you. And let's assume that it's true that lying is one of these things that degrades your moral character. Well, if both of those are true, then the conclusion must logically be true. Because again, the information that you see in the conclusion is already sort of contained in that information that's in the premises. Do you see that? Do you see how when you look at the premises, you should be able to sort of just see that it must be the case then that lying is bad for you, right? It sort of goes along with those statements. You can have a lot of deductive arguments using if-then statements. This is why your computer runs on propositional logic. Okay, so you're gonna learn propositional logic, and essentially that's the software that your computer is running on. I mean, you've heard that computers run in binary code, right? Zeros and ones. It's the same in logic. Uh, some logicians actually use 0 and 1. I'm going to use true and false instead, but it's still binary. And a lot of computer programming language has these if-then statements. If A, then B. A. So then your computer, if you put in the input A, then your computer will give the output B, whatever that is. All right, so you've got all these if-then statements inside your computer. That's just an interesting to-the-side thing, right? These if-then statements become very important in what we're going to do in propositional logic, and they also underlie computing. If it's raining, then I will bring an umbrella. It is raining, therefore I will bring an umbrella, right? Pretty straightforward, right? And I hope you see that it's, again, one of these cases where if for the sake of argument you just say, okay, let's suppose that premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true, well then of course it follows that I will bring an umbrella. Because look, if it's raining and I didn't bring an umbrella, that would mean that the first premise is false, right? But we're assuming for the sake of argument that the premises are true, right? So assuming that, then must the conclusion be true? Well, yes, because to deny it would then to deny one of the premises, right? Do you see that? If you contradict the conclusion here, you'd be contradicting one of the premises, right? So if you see me and I'm not bringing an umbrella, what does that mean? Well, it means that either premise 1 or 2 is false, right? You see how when you have a deductive argument, if the premises are true, there's just no logical way for the conclusion to be false, right? Which is different from inductive arguments. Here's an example where I purposely used false premises so you could see my point that whether or not an argument is a deductively valid argument, I'm already using valid, let's just stick to, if it's a good deductive argument, if it has the correct kind of form, right, then the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. Which in this case, the premises are not true, unfortunately, as much as I might want to be a wizard. I'm not, right? But the argument is still a deductive argument, because if the premises were to be true, the conclusion would logically have to be true. Yeah, I hope everyone's understanding that. Right, just, again, imagine a sci-fi thought experiment, right? Imagine the world was like that. Imagine, yeah, keyword being if in there, sure, yes, exactly, yeah. I'm saying if I'm a wizard, then I'm friends with a unicorn. But then I'm also directly saying something that's false. I'm a wizard, which is not true. But you can imagine a world in which it is true that all wizards are friends with unicorns. And this is also a world in which it is true that I'm a wizard. Well, in such a world, of course, I would be friends with a unicorn, right? If those are your beginning premises, assuming that they're true, then you can conclude logically this other thing must also be true. But in a way, it's not even another thing. It's already contained, right? It's not new information. When you've stated premise 1 and 2, you basically already stated that I am friends with a unicorn, right? You're already committed to that. Whereas if you say the sun has been rising for every day for millions of years, it's new information to say it will also do that tomorrow. That's not somehow contained in my premises already. That's new information. So in a way, inductive arguments, that's if they're problematic because there's always this possibility that they're wrong, but inductive arguments are more likely to give us new information. That's why a lot of deductive reasoning is mostly used in things like computing and in math and logic and analyzing things, where you're not necessarily getting new information, you're just sort of extrapolating what's already there. Inductive reasoning, you're going beyond what you already have, right? I already have an experience of the sun rising every day, but now I'm going beyond that, and I'm also saying, and you know what, I bet you it'll do it again tomorrow. Right? But I'm going out on a ledge when I say that, or I'm going out on a limb when I say that. Not a ledge, a limb. I'm mixing metaphors. I'm going out on a limb when I say that, to some extent. Right? That's different from these deductive arguments, where the conclusion is basically just a restatement of what's already implied by the premises. Making sense in class, and then later you'll try to do it, and it won't. And so you can see that deductive arguments have this sort of linked support rather than convergent, where it's all these different points pointing towards the truth of a conclusion or the probable truth of a conclusion. And in a good deductive argument, you sort of need both of those premises to really get it going, logically speaking, right? Because again, let's go back. I skipped over this one because it's so similar to the other one. I wanted to show here that you could have a valid argument with a false premise that still has a true conclusion, right? This came up earlier, a little while ago, right? Someone asked, so if an argument is bad, does that mean the conclusion is false? No. So here we have an argument it's logically valid, the conclusion follows, but of course I'm relying on what's actually a false premise, which ultimately we don't want. Right? We can assume the truth of a premise just to figure out if it's a deductive or inductive argument, but ultimately you're going to reject any argument that has false premises. So this is actually a bad argument because I'm not a wizard, so you can't rely on this argument. But it happens to have a true conclusion, right? I do own at least one shirt, right? But it's a bad argument that I made. But that's not what I was saying. What was I saying? Yes, this linked support. Yes, exactly. Right. So for example, if I just have premise 2 and not premise 1, if it just said I'm a wizard, therefore I own at least one shirt. Well, if you know the terminology, you would say, well, that's a non sequitur. Right? It does not follow at all from the fact that you're a wizard. Right? The fact of you being a wizard is totally logically compatible with not owning any shirts. Right? It's not until you actually specify with that first premise that you are meaning to say that all wizards own at least one shirt. Then you have a deductive argument, right? Then once you grant the premises of the truth of the premises, you can see that the conclusion must be true. We'll be done pretty soon. So this is what Maggie was asking about. Right? So when you have a good inductive argument where if the premises are true, it makes the conclusion really probable. For example, the sun will rise tomorrow. Right? The fact that my premises are true, the sun has been rising every day for millions of years. Right? That makes it very probable. So it's a very strong argument. Some other arguments are not as strong. Think of an argument that's not very strong. I should have thought of an example ahead of time. It's always good to do examples, right? I try to have lots of examples. I forgot to come up with one. You know, I can kind of see out the window. I can't see very well. It looks a little hazy. It's probably smoke again. Well, that's not the strongest argument. You know, it gets pretty cloudy and foggy in Humboldt anyway. Right? The mere fact that I see that it's kind of like bleak out there, that's kind of a weak argument for the idea that it must be fires again. It must be smoke from fires. It might be, but it might also just be cloud or something. Or maybe this chunk of my window is actually not really showing me what the weather is like outside, right? So if I had an argument that says, well, it kind of looks murky from what I can tell, I bet you the Eureka skies are filled with smoke again. That's a weak inductive argument. Right? It's still an inductive argument. I'm providing some reason to think that it's true, right? I'm not saying, oh, it's totally bright and sunny, so it's smoky out. That would make no sense. I'm saying something like, well, it looks a little cloudy, or it looks a little dim out there, so it's the fires. Well, I've got some support for my conclusion, but it's a pretty weak argument. So that's what we call it in an inductive argument. We talk about the relative strength of the argument, right? How much support do the premises provide for the conclusion? Okay? And for everyday purposes, we don't have to get that precise or mathematical about it, right? If you were to actually do science, it'd be very different. But for everyday purposes, it's just sort of a thing to keep in mind. I'm not going to ask you to be like, oh, it's 78.5% likely. We don't really know that kind of stuff, but you can have some sort of general sense, right? There's some general sense in which my argument about the sun rising tomorrow is much stronger than my argument about it being smoky out, right? And the argument about Jennifer probably not having a good day is somewhere in between. So we can judge relative strengths of arguments. And that's all I'm really going to ask you to do. It's a little difficult to be able to assign an actual numerical value to that. It's just something to keep in mind. Deductive arguments have sort of a sliding scale of strength, right? And it might depend on the context whether or not you want to accept a conclusion as something that you're going to base your decisions on, right? It depends on what the stakes are. There are all sorts of practical considerations that come into play as well. But here, all I'm asking you to realize is that some of your reasoning has this kind of feature, where the thing that you're reasoning to just has a strength associated with it, with the argument for it. It's either a strong argument or a weak argument or somewhere in between, right? And so for an inductive argument, that's your job, is, well, how strong of a support do you think these premises provide? Right? And I can't really give you just a guidebook towards that, right? That's going to be up to you depending on what the subject matter is. I'm just saying one of the tools you need to be aware of, or one of the things you need to be aware of, is this idea that inductive arguments are evaluated in terms of their strength, right? And deductive arguments are evaluated in terms of their validity, right? Are they valid? Deductive arguments are supposed to guarantee the truth of the conclusions when the premises are true. Right? That's what makes it valid. So then we call it valid rather than strong. Okay. Let's see. I would like you to do this, but we're going to run sort of out of time. Okay, so you know what I'll do? I will leave this up. So you can write it down or do a screenshot or something like that. I'd like you to do them, but you don't have to turn them in, okay? But then next time I'll go over these. Maybe because we have a little bit of time, I'll go over like 3 of them. How about that? We have enough time to do that. Okay? Yeah. So we're sort of, so now you have to just use what you learned to try to think about these arguments. Do you think they're inductive, or they're supposed to be inductive, or are they supposed to be deductive? Well, so argument number 1. If God had meant us to fly, he would have given us wings. We don't have wings, so obviously we are not meant to fly. Is that inductive or deductive? Yes, you're both correct. It's deductive. Yeah, it's one of those if-then statements, right? A lot of times that's the clue that it's going to be a deductive argument. Yeah, because if you have both of those premises, then the conclusion logically follows. And again, it does not matter in this case when we're trying to figure out whether it's inductive or deductive, or if it's valid or not. It doesn't matter if the premises are really true or false. We haven't gotten to that part of the evaluation yet. All you need to ask yourself is, suppose they were true. Would that conclusion logically follow? Well, suppose it's true that if it is really true that God meant us to fly, then he would have given us wings. Well, then the fact that I don't have wings shows that God did not mean us to fly, right? It would follow logically, right? So this is a deductive argument because if those premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. And uh, again, that's if, right? If the premises are true. We're just sort of playing pretend. We're saying, what if the world was like that, where both of those premises were true? What else would what could we conclude then? Well, we would be able to conclude that we're not meant to fly. Okay. Two, the drug successfully treated the disease in lab rats, so it will successfully treat the disease in humans as well. Inductive or deductive? Yes, exactly, right? Maybe a lot of this is why they do these kind of trials, right? They do experiments on animals because in many cases, some of our physiological features are similar enough to where if a drug works on a monkey, it'll work on us or something like that, or on a rat. But that's always going to be inductive. It's always going to be probabilistic. Yeah, so we are very similar to rats in certain ways. That's right. That's sort of surprising, but then yeah, people do experiments on rats to maybe shed some light on what humans are like and what kind of treatments might be successful with human beings. But that's always going to be an inductive sort of thing, right? Just because it was able to treat a disease in lab rats does not guarantee that it will in humans as well. Right? If the science is well known behind it, and a competent scientist might say, well, it's going to be very likely. Right? So this might be a strong argument, but it's not a valid argument. It's not a deductive argument. Right? So it could be a good argument because it's a good inductive argument. Right? Possible, yeah. It's just not a deductive argument because the truth of the conclusion is not guaranteed by the truth of the premises. What about number 3? This is an example from a few weeks ago that we already used. Just want to see what what Cassandra is going to say the answer is. Well, I'll just say it. It is deductive, right? It's the same sort of thing. You went back and forth. Well, it's one of those things where, what if it was really true that good health depends on good nutrition? And what if it's really true that good nutrition requires a sufficient income? Right? So let's say the world is like this. To be healthy, you need good food. To have good food, you need sufficient income. Let's say those are both true. Well, then it logically follows that good health in that kind of world would require sufficient income, right? Now, I think we mentioned there's ways that you can disagree with the premises, right? You might say good nutrition doesn't require sufficient income. Maybe even if good nutrition is expensive, maybe there's some other way to get it. You might disagree with the premise, but that's not what's in question here, right? That's the whole thing is you have to imagine the world to be like what the premises say. In such a world, would the conclusion also have to be true? Well, if that's what the world was like, that good health depends on good nutrition and good nutrition always requires sufficient income, then yeah, then in that world, good health does require sufficient income. What would you cut out? What fat would you cut out? I think you need all of it. I think you need all of the ones in number 3. Right? The argument would be premise 1, good health depends on good nutrition. Premise 2, you cut out but. Yes. Premise 2, good nutrition requires a sufficient income. Conclusion, good health requires a sufficient income, right? So there is some fat to get rid of. You get rid of the word but, and you get rid of the conclusion indicator so. Yeah, if you were to put it in premise conclusion format. Yeah. But we're not worried about that here. Here you're just thinking, well, if the premises are true, if I imagine them to be true, would the conclusion also logically have to be true? And in this case, yes. Right? You can't say good health depends on good nutrition requires a sufficient income, but good health does not require sufficient income. That doesn't make sense given the premises. Right? Okay, it's 125. So yeah, I'll just let you do the rest of them. I'll leave this up for 5 minutes so that I'm going to turn my camera off, but I'll still be here. So if you have a quick question about one of them for the next 5 minutes, I will be here. Go over them. You don't have to write it down, but go over it so that you can kind of think about it. Okay, so you kind of get used to the differences, and just keep asking yourself that crucial question, right? So in this case, I made sure that all the arguments they're functional, they're good arguments, but they're just either inductive or deductive. And so ask yourself, right, does the truth of the premises guarantee that the conclusion is going to be true? If it logically guarantees it, then it's deductive. If it only supports the conclusion, if it makes it more probable, but there's some possibility that even if the premises are right and the conclusion could be false, then it's inductive. Okay, thank you, everyone. We'll see you on Thursday. I'm going to try not to miss any of these meetings. I kind of thought it wouldn't be a big deal to miss them because the class is all online and most people don't actually show up for this. I don't know. I think I probably should always do these, so I might even do some extra ones at some point. But anyway, see you on Thursday. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for showing up. I always appreciate the people that do show up. It makes me feel better. Thank you.